At my grandmother's funeral, my sister Sloane leaned toward our aunt in the third pew and whispered, loud enough for half the chapel to hear, "The Cow-Dung girl finally made it. Try not to stain the pews, Cass." I was standing 10 feet from Grandma Martha's casket, barn mud on my boots, hay dust on my coat. And my own sister decided that was the moment. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. My name is Cassidy Thorne. I'm 31 years old. I'm a large animal veterinary technician, and I drive a mud-caked Chevy pickup that smells like antiseptic and livestock no matter what I do to it. For the past 6 years, I lived on my grandmother's 100-acre ranch outside Bozeman, Montana at the foot of the Bridger Mountains, where the winters come in hard and don't apologize for it. I didn't stay because I had nowhere else to be. I stayed because somebody had to actually be there, not just send a flower arrangement. Not just call on her birthday for 9 minutes. Be there. Every Medicare form. Every pharmacy run in a February snowstorm. Every 3 a.m. when she couldn't get her breathing right and the dark felt very close and she needed a hand to hold until it passed. She used to watch nature documentaries and argue with the narrator. "That bear knows exactly what he's doing," she'd say, shaking her finger at the screen. She was usually wrong. I never told her. I loved every single second of it. Sloane is my older sister. She's 36. She lives in Chicago in an apartment she calls her luxury high-rise. Her Instagram looks like a lifestyle magazine, boutique bags, restaurant brunches, little captions like "living my best life," all of it paid for with credit lines I didn't know existed until later. She arrived at the funeral in a designer suit, and wearing Grandma Martha's vintage turquoise brooch, the one that was supposed to be locked in the estate safe. She thought she'd come to collect. Then came Monday morning. In Silas Vance's office, Sloane stood up from her chair, right there, in front of everyone, and declared out loud that the will was a forgery and she was hiring a lawyer immediately. The attorney looked at her quietly and said, "By stating your intention to challenge this document, you have triggered the no contest clause. Your bequest is now void." Sloane's face went white. Martha saw everything. She planned everything. And I keep asking myself what would have happened if I'd signed that deed the day they pushed it across the table. The cold came in hard that February, the way it always did in Bozeman, not with warning, but with a kind of absolute certainty, as if the land itself had decided to make a point. By 4:30 in the morning, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees and the sky above the Bridger Mountains was still the deep, bruised purple of a night that hadn't quite let go. Cassidy Thorne was already awake. She'd been awake since 3. Her barn boots were laced and her heavy canvas work coat was pulled tight across her shoulders before the coffee finished brewing. She drank half a cup standing at the kitchen window, watching the snow come down in thin, windless curtains across the yard. The porch light threw a pale yellow circle out onto the ground, and beyond it, everything dissolved into dark. She could hear the cattle moving in the far barn, low, unsettled sounds that told her something was wrong before she'd even stepped outside. She left the coffee on the counter and went out into it. The mud between the house and the barn had frozen solid overnight, then thawed slightly in the afternoon. Then frozen again into a rough, uneven crust that cracked under her boots with each step. Cass had made this walk so many times she could have done it blind, and on certain mornings, in certain moods. It almost felt that way, her body moving on its own while her mind stayed somewhere else. She'd learned, over the years, that there was a particular kind of peace in physical work. Not the peace of rest, but the peace of necessity. You stopped thinking about everything else because there was only this, only right now, only what needed doing. The heifer in the third stall had been in labor since midnight. Cass could see it the moment she pushed open the barn door, the animal's hindquarters slick with exertion, her sides heaving, her eyes wide with the particular exhausted panic of a first birth gone too long. The other cattle shifted and stamped in their stalls, picking up on her distress the way animals do, broadcasting it back in waves. "Easy," Cass said, low and even. "I'm here. Easy now." She stripped off her coat, rolled her sleeves to the elbow, and got to work. What followed was 40 minutes of pure, grinding effort, her hands going numb inside the birth canal, her knees in the mud and hay, her breath coming in hard clouds of steam in the frozen air. There was nothing romantic about it. It was cold and unglamorous and it required everything she had. But when the calf finally came, a big, wet, trembling thing that shook its head and tried immediately to stand. Cass felt the deep, uncomplicated satisfaction that had kept her doing this work for 6 years. She helped the calf find its footing, checked its airway, watched the heifer turn instinctively and begin to clean it. She sat back on her heels in the straw. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself feel it, the warmth radiating off the animals. The soft sounds of the barn settling around her, the particular hush of a Montana winter morning before the world started up again. This was her life. These acres, this cold, this work. She had never once resented any of it. Back inside, she washed up at the kitchen sink, the water going from ice cold to scalding in the uneven way the old pipes had always run. She refilled her coffee and noticed, as she often did, the stillness of the house around her. For 6 years it had been a house with a presence in it, footsteps from the back bedroom, the murmur of the television at odd hours. The faint smell of talcum powder and lavender that followed Grandma Martha everywhere she went. Now the house held only the echo of all that. The quiet had a different quality to it these days. Heavier, more deliberate. Martha had been gone for 11 days. Cass set her mug down and picked up the stack of mail she'd been avoiding for the past week. Bills, mostly the property tax bill that made her stomach drop every time she looked at it, a notice from the county assessor. 2 pieces of junk mail addressed to Martha Thorne that Cass hadn't been able to bring herself to throw away. And at the bottom of the pile, tucked between a ranch supply catalog and a water utility statement, a piece of paper that didn't belong. It was a Medicare summary notice, a printout of charges billed under Martha's account. Cass had seen dozens of these over the years, had learned to read them the way some people read financial statements. Tracking every entry against her own notes. Martha's prescriptions had been filled at the same Bozeman pharmacy for the past 4 years without exception. She knew the charges, she knew the amounts, she knew the rhythm of them. She didn't recognize the pharmacy listed on this charge. The address printed in small type beneath the billing code was in Chicago, Illinois. Cass stood at the kitchen table for a long moment, the paper in her hand, the coffee going cold. She read the entry a second time, and then a third. The charge was modest $62, the kind of amount that might slip past unnoticed. But the date on it was 8 months ago. And the pharmacy was in Chicago. Sloan lived in Chicago. She set the paper down carefully, as if it were something that might startle. Outside, the pale light was beginning to lift across the fields, washing the snow a thin, cold blue. The Bridger Range was just becoming visible in the distance, rising out of the dark like something that had always been patient. Cass thought about the funeral 2 days ago. She had driven 3 hours to the church in town, arriving with mud still in the creases of her knuckles despite 2 rounds of scrubbing. She had worn the good wool coat she kept for occasions like this. And she had sat in the second pew and tried to let herself grieve properly, tried to allow the full weight of losing Martha to land the way it deserved to land. But the moment she'd walked in, Sloan had been there. Polished and perfumed and wearing a black dress that had certainly not come off a department store rack. She'd leaned toward Cass with a small, curved smile and said, just barely above a whisper, "The Cow-Dung girl finally arrived. Try not to stain the pews." Cass had said nothing. She had learned, long ago, the value of saying nothing. But it wasn't what Sloan said that had stayed with her. It was what Sloan was wearing. Martha's turquoise brooch, the vintage piece with the silver setting, the one that had sat on Martha's bureau for as long as Cass could remember. The one that was supposed to be locked in the safe in the back office was pinned to the lapel of Sloan's coat. It caught the light as Sloan turned away, and Cass had felt something go still and cold inside her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. She had said nothing then, either. She had filed it away. That was what she did. She filed things away. Now she looked at the Medicare notice on the kitchen table, and she looked at the window, and she looked at the pale blue light spreading slowly across the fields where she had spent 6 years of her life. The ranch had always felt peaceful to her. The particular silence of it, the wind in the fence wire, the distant low of cattle. The creak of the old house at night had always felt like safety, like something solid beneath her feet. She had built herself around that solidity, quietly and without asking anyone's permission. But standing at the table with that piece of paper in front of her, looking out at the land Martha had loved, Cass felt the quality of that silence shift. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like the held breath of something waiting. Like the moment before a storm front rolled in off the mountains when the air went perfectly still. And the cattle stopped grazing and every living thing on the land seemed to understand, instinctively, that what was coming would require all of them to be ready. She folded the Medicare notice carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of her canvas coat. Then she picked up her coffee, finished it standing at the window, and went back outside to check on the calf. The reception at the ranch house started at noon and ran long, the way these things always did in small Montana communities, where people had driven 40 minutes on icy roads and weren't in a hurry to turn around. Neighbors Cass had known her whole life filed through the front door with casserole dishes and covered pans. Marge Dutton with her green bean bake, old Pete Halverson with a pot of venison chili, the Kowalski girls from the next property over with a lemon pound cake wrapped in foil and tied with a ribbon. They moved through the living room in their good coats, speaking in the measured, careful tones people used when death had just been in a house, their eyes drifting to the photographs on the mantel, the worn armchair by the window where Martha had spent her last winters. Cass stood near the kitchen doorway and received them. She shook hands and accepted hugs and said thank you. She was doing all right, yes. It was a blessing Martha hadn't suffered long at the end. Yes, she would call if she needed anything. She meant every word she said and none of it touched the cold, watchful part of her mind that had been working steadily since she'd found the Medicare notice that morning. Sloane was not receiving anyone. She was at the far end of the living room near the window, her phone held at arm's length and slightly elevated, angled to catch the winter light coming through the lace curtains. She'd been filming, on and off, for the better part of an hour, tilting her head, adjusting her expression, turning briefly to take in the room behind her with a composed, photogenic look of tasteful sorrow. Cass had watched her position the flower arrangement on the side table twice to improve the background. She had watched her slide a piece of paper, a folded envelope Cass couldn't make out from across the room behind the vase before going back to filming. Your grandmother would have hated that, said a voice beside her. It was Dottie Halverson, Pete's wife, 73 years old and holding a cup of decaf with both hands. She was watching Sloane with an expression of open, untroubled disapproval. She would have, Cass agreed quietly. Martha always said that one had a gift for being somewhere without actually being there. Dottie patted Cass's arm. You were here, though. Every day. That meant everything to her. She told me so. Cass nodded and thanked her and watched Dottie make her way toward the dessert table. Then she looked back at the flower vase. When the room shifted when a new group of neighbors came through the door and drew Sloane's attention briefly toward the entrance, Cass crossed to the side table, lifted the flower arrangement, and pulled out the paper that had been tucked behind it. It was an envelope, already opened. The return address was for a real estate development firm out of Billings. The letter inside was dated 3 weeks before Martha died. Cass read it once, quickly, then folded it and put it in her coat pocket alongside the Medicare notice. Her hands were steady. Her face was steady. She replaced the flowers and moved back toward the kitchen. The letter was a preliminary inquiry, professional and carefully worded, the kind of letter that knew how to be interested in a property without technically offering anything yet. It referenced the acreage, the location relative to a proposed development corridor, and expressed eagerness to discuss terms at the earliest opportunity. It was addressed to Sloane Thorne Montgomery. Not to the estate, not to the family, to Sloane, personally. 3 weeks before Martha died. Cass stood at the kitchen sink and ran cold water over her wrists, the way she did when she needed to keep her head clear. She looked out the window at the barn, at the fence line, at the long white fields running out toward the mountains. 100 acres. Martha's whole life. The ground under Cass's own feet for the past 6 years. The sound of heavy footsteps behind her, and then the weight of a large hand dropping onto her shoulder. Cass. Kiddo. Barrett's voice had the particular texture of a man who'd been drinking since before the guests arrived, not sloppy yet, but smoothed out, his edges rounded off in that way that always made him seem friendlier than he was. He smelled of gin and the particular brand of men's cologne he'd been wearing since the 1990s. Been meaning to catch you alone. She turned to face him. He was a big man gone soft in the middle. His good shirt straining at the buttons, his face carrying the ruddy, slightly inflamed look of a man whose liver had been fielding complaints for decades. "We need to talk about the estate," he said. "The 401k, the property, all of it. There are decisions that have to get made." "The will hasn't been read yet," Cass said. I know. But realistically, Cass," he spread his hands in a gesture meant to convey reasonableness. 100 acres is a lot for one person. The taxes alone. And the maintenance on a place this size, without the income stream. Martha had, he shook his head with an expression of paternal concern that didn't reach his eyes. "I just think the smart move, the practical move, is to sell the whole parcel. Clean break. You'd get your share, you could start fresh somewhere. City, maybe. Go use that certification of yours somewhere you can actually shower regular." He laughed at his own joke. Cass did not. "I'll wait for the reading," she said. Something flickered across his face, not quite irritation, not quite something else. He covered it quickly. "Sure," he said easily. "Sure, that's fair. Just wanted to get ahead of it. You know how these things can get complicated." He patted her shoulder twice and moved back toward the living room, and Cass turned back to the window. She was still standing there 20 minutes later when she heard Sloane's voice from the pantry, bright and slightly theatrical. The voice she used when she was performing casualness. Cass moved quietly to the pantry doorway. The old pantry shelf beside the door held a row of mason jars and dry goods. And, for as long as Cass could remember, a wide-mouthed ball jar that Martha had kept tucked behind the cornmeal. Emergency cash, Martha had called it. Nothing dramatic, usually a few $100s in small bills. The kind of money that was useful when you needed a plumber on a Sunday or the power went out and you needed to get to town. Martha had kept that jar for 30 years. Sloane was counting the bills onto the pantry shelf, her Louis Vuitton bag hanging from the crook of her elbow. "Sloane." Cass's voice came out quieter than she intended. Sloane looked up without embarrassment. "Oh, relax. There's barely $300 in here. That's Grandma's." Was Grandma's. Sloane folded the bills and tucked them into her bag with the efficient movements of someone completing a small, unremarkable transaction. "Consider it my travel expenses. Do you know what a last-minute flight from Chicago costs? And this place," she glanced around the pantry with an expression of mild distaste. "Honestly, Cass, you've been living out here in the mud for 6 years and this is still the condition of the pantry?" Cass felt the words she wanted to say rise up in her throat and stop there. She thought of the letter in her pocket. She thought of the brooch at the funeral. She thought of the Medicare charge from a Chicago pharmacy. She thought of how much she did not want Sloane to know what she was thinking. "Put it back," she said. Sloane smiled a small, practiced smile that communicated very clearly that she had no intention of doing any such thing. And walked past Cass back into the kitchen. The guests were beginning to leave. Cass went through the motions of seeing them out, accepting the last of the handshakes and the promises to call. When the final car had pulled down the drive, she went back through the house and moved from room to room in the quiet, looking at what remained. The flower arrangement Sloane had rearranged for her video. The pantry shelf where the jar now sat empty. The living room with its photographs and its worn furniture and its particular smell of old wood. And whatever Martha had always burned in that little candle warmer by the door. Cass stood in the middle of it and understood something clearly for the first time. With the full weight of understanding rather than just the anxious suspicion she'd been carrying since morning. This house, to Sloane and to Barrett, was not a home. It was not 6 years of her life. It was not the place where she had learned to read a dying woman's needs from the sound of her breathing. Or sat up through fevers, or held a hand through the particular fear that comes at 2 in the morning when a person knows they are running out of time. To them, it was inventory. It was acreage and square footage and a development corridor and the question of what the market would bear. She looked at the empty jar on the pantry shelf. She was not going to let them have it. The oak table in the ranch house dining room had been there longer than any of them. Longer than Martha's tenure on the property, longer certainly than Barrett's brief and unsuccessful attempt at ranching in the early years of his marriage, longer than any of the arguments and celebrations and ordinary Tuesday dinners that had taken place around it. It was a scarred, heavy thing, the surface marked with the history of decades, a burn ring near one end from a pot set down without a trivet, initials gouged into the underside that Cass had discovered as a child. The particular uneven quality of old wood that had expanded and contracted through 50 Montana winters. Martha had refinished it twice and both times declared it looked better before she'd started. It was around this table, 2 days after the reception, that Sloane chose to make her intentions official. She arrived at 10 in the morning in a cream-colored blouse that was wrong for the weather and a pair of heeled boots that had no business on a ranch in February. She set a large portfolio down on the table with a decisive sound and opened it to a glossy, color-printed prospectus. Cass saw the words Bridger Range Resort and Residential Development across the top in embossed silver lettering before she'd even taken her seat. Barrett was already there, settled into his usual chair at the head of the table with a cup of coffee he'd helped himself to without asking. He had the look of a man who had slept badly and was compensating with a performance of ease. He nodded at Cass when she came in. She sat across from Sloane and put both hands flat on the table and waited. "All right," Sloane said, turning the prospectus to face Cass. "I'm going to be direct, because I think that's what this situation calls for." She paused, as if she expected acknowledgement of this generosity. Cass gave her nothing. "The developers have been eyeing this corridor for 2 years, Sloane continued, tapping the prospectus with one manicured finger. 100 acres at this location, with the mountain views and the proximity to the highway. We're talking about a significant offer." Significant. She let the word sit there. The kind of money that would set all three of us up properly. "The estate hasn't been settled," Cass said. "We don't know what the will says." "We know what it says," Barrett said from the head of the table, his voice carrying the comfortable authority of a man who has decided something. "Martha wasn't exactly complicated in her finances. We split it 3 ways, we sell the property, everybody wins." "We don't know that." Sloane made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something precisely calibrated to communicate that she found Cass faintly tiresome. She reached across the table and slid a document toward the center. Cass looked at it without touching it. It was a quitclaim deed, already prepared, with a signature line at the bottom. "What this does," Sloane said, in the tone of someone explaining something simple to someone slow, "is allow the property to be transferred cleanly. So we can engage the developers before another buyer comes in. It's just procedural. It transfers my rights to the property," Cass said. "Technically, it transfers my rights. Before the will is read. Before we know what Martha actually wanted." Cass kept her voice level. "I'm not signing that." The room was quiet for a moment. Barrett shifted in his chair. "Cass." He leaned forward, setting his coffee down. "Honey, you're 31 years old. This ranch, the taxes alone, the maintenance, the equipment costs. It's not a realistic situation for a single person. You know that." He spread his hands in that same gesture from the reception, the one that was meant to look like reason. "You've got skills. You've got your certification. You could go anywhere, Missoula, Billings, Denver even. Start fresh. Get a real apartment. Get a life that doesn't involve," he gestured vaguely, "all this." "All this," Cass repeated. The mud, the cold. He picked up his coffee again. And as he did, his hand moved quickly, not quickly enough, over the edge of the table, pushing something beneath his napkin. Cass caught the corner of it before it disappeared. An envelope, the kind that came from a collection agency, with the hard, aggressive font of a final notice. She didn't reach for it. She simply noted it. "You're too young to be tied to a property like this," Barrett continued, recovering his momentum. "Go get a job somewhere you can actually shower." He chuckled, and Sloane smiled, and Cass sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at both of them. "I changed her diapers," Cass said. The words came out quieter than she intended, but they were clear. "I changed her diapers while you were changing your profile pictures, Sloane. I was here every single night for 6 years. I was here when she couldn't breathe, and I was here when she was scared, and I was here when she didn't know where she was anymore." She looked at her father. "You haven't been here in 3 years. You didn't call on her birthday." The silence that followed was brief. Then Sloane laughed, a light, dismissive sound that Cass felt somewhere behind her sternum. "Oh, Cass. Don't do that. Don't make yourself the martyr." She began filing her nails, her attention dropping to her hands with the casual completeness of someone who has stopped listening. "You got free rent for 6 years. That was your compensation. And honestly, given the condition of this place, that was generous." She glanced up. Now pack your boots. The developers are coming Monday. Cass looked at the quitclaim deed on the table. She looked at the glossy prospectus with its silver lettering and its architect's renderings of what this land could become: the angular rooflines, the swimming pools, the carefully manicured landscaping that had replaced, in the artist's imagination, everything that actually grew here. She looked at her father's napkin covering whatever letter he was hiding. She looked at her sister's hand, still wearing the turquoise brooch. She did not reach for the pen. "The will gets read first," she said. "I'll be there. You can both do whatever you want after that." She stood up, pushing her chair back from the table. "But I'm not signing anything today." She left the room without raising her voice. Behind her, she heard Sloane make a small sound of exasperation, heard the crinkle of Barrett shifting the napkin. She went out through the kitchen, pulled her coat from the hook by the back door, and stepped outside into the cold. The air hit her face like a clean hand. She stood on the back step and breathed it in the sharp pine and iron smell of a Montana winter morning. The distant sound of her cattle moving in the far pasture. She put her hands in her pockets and felt the folded edges of the Medicare notice and the real estate letter. They were so sure of themselves. That was what got her, underneath the anger, the absolute, unexamined certainty with which they had walked into this house and begun counting what was in it. Sloane with her prospectus and her collection calls hidden behind vases. Barrett with his gambling debt tucked under his napkin and his casual suggestion that her entire 6 years of life here had been a kind of freeloading. The arrogance of them was so thick you could almost see it, Cass thought. So dense and self-satisfied that it had made them careless. And careless people, in her experience, missed things. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the barn. She was going to need to be very careful. And she was going to need to not miss anything at all. She found the property tax bill again at 11 o'clock that night. She hadn't meant to, she'd already seen it, already processed. The number, already felt the drop in her stomach that $12,000 produced in a person who had $4,200 in her checking account. But she'd been going through Martha's papers at the kitchen table, trying to get a complete picture before the will reading, and the bill was in the second folder. She opened, and there it was again, $12,000, due in 43 days, against a property that was not yet legally hers. She set it to one side and kept going. By midnight she had spread across the table a picture she hadn't fully seen before, and it was worse than she'd expected. The medical bills, the ones she'd known about, the ones she'd helped Martha manage, were accounted for. But in a separate accordion folder she found a stack of statements she'd never seen, tucked behind a divider labeled miscellaneous, and when she went through them, she understood that Sloane had been managing, or more precisely failing to manage, a parallel set of Martha's accounts. Prescription charges billed to a secondary insurance. Home health aid invoices that had gone unpaid for months. A medical equipment rental that had accrued late fees going back 8 months. The total, when Cass added it up on the notepad she kept beside the folder, was just over $30,000. $30,000 in Martha's name. Unpaid. Ignored. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and tried to breathe evenly. The kitchen was cold. She'd turned the thermostat down to save on the heating bill. And the old house let the cold in through its windows and its baseboards and the gap under the back door that she'd been meaning to reseal for 2 winters now. The overhead light threw a hard, flat light across the table and all its papers, and the clock on the wall ticked, and outside the wind moved across the fields in the particular low, searching way it did in February, finding every weakness in every structure it passed. She got up and walked to the back of the house. In the small room off the hallway, what had been Martha's room before she'd moved to the more accessible bedroom near the front, there was still a walker in the corner. Chrome and rubber handled, the kind with the small wheels on the front legs and the tennis balls on the back ones. Martha's tennis balls had been green once and had worn down to a dull gray over the course of the last 2 years. Cass had bought her new ones twice, and Martha had refused both times. "I know where these ones are in the dark," she'd said. "New ones would confuse my feet." Cass stood in the doorway and looked at it. She didn't go in. She stood in the doorway with her hand against the frame and looked at the walker in the corner and at the empty chair beside it and at the window above the chair, which still had the bird feeder attached to its outer sill, the feeder Cass refilled every week because Martha could watch it from her chair and name every bird that came to it. Even toward the end, when other names had started to slip away. You're still here, Cass thought. Not to anyone in particular. Just to the room. To the residue of a person who had been present in a place for so long. That something of them remained in the walls, in the arrangement of the furniture, in the worn spot on the floor where the walker's front wheels had rested 1,000 times. She went back to the kitchen. At the table she sat with the tax bill and the medical statements and the real estate letter, and she looked at all of it. And she felt the full weight of it come down. Not in pieces, the way it had been coming since the funeral, not as individual pieces of evidence or individual acts of cruelty. But all at once, as a single thing. 6 years. 6 years of 5 a.m. wake-ups and insurance calls and pharmacy runs and the particular grinding monotony of caring for someone who needed everything. 6 years of watching the ranch. 6 years of her own life lived inside the margins of someone else's need. And she had given all of it without measuring it, without keeping score, because that was not why she'd done it. And this was what remained. $30,000 of debt in a dead woman's name. A $12,000 tax bill. A table full of papers that Sloan and Barrett had either caused or ignored, and a quitclaim deed waiting for her signature. She pressed her fist against the table. Then she pressed it harder. Then she pushed back her chair and stood up and walked to the barn because she couldn't stay in the house with it, she couldn't just sit at that table and hold all of it still. She needed to move, she needed the cold, she needed something to push back against. The barn was dark except for the pilot light on the heater unit near the water trough. Cass didn't turn on the overhead lights. She stood in the middle of the barn floor in the near dark. The smell of hay and livestock and frozen ground around her, and she pressed the heel of her hand against the nearest post and then, once, hard, the flat of her fist. The wood gave nothing back. Her knuckles stung. Is this how it ends? The thought moved through her with real force. Me in the mud, and them in a penthouse built on all of this? She stood there with her fist against the post and her eyes closed and let the question be what it was, not rhetorical. Not dramatic, a genuine question that deserved a genuine answer. And then, underneath it, quieter but more durable number. She said it aloud, to the barn, to the dark, to no one in particular. No. She said it again, and her voice was steady. I won't let you take it. She didn't know yet exactly what that meant in practical terms. She didn't have a plan. She had a Medicare notice and a real estate letter and a document full of unpaid bills, and she had 11 days of grief still sitting unprocessed somewhere in the middle of her chest. And she had 43 days until a property tax bill she couldn't pay came due on land that wasn't yet legally hers. But she also had 6 years. 6 years of knowing this property and this woman better than any developer's prospectus or quitclaim deed could account for. 6 years of paying attention. 6 years of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what needed doing. She had been present, and it occurred to her, standing in the dark barn with her knuckles stinging and the cold coming up through the floor into her boots, that being present had perhaps left her with more than anyone yet knew. She stayed in the barn until her breathing evened out and the cold had settled into something manageable. Then she went back inside, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. But when she did, it was without the particular helplessness that had been under everything since Martha died. Replaced by something harder and quieter and more useful. Something that felt, if not quite like hope, then at least like its foundation. Well, friends, here we are, halfway through Cassidy's story, and I have to say, my heart has been right there with her every step of the way. We've watched Cass do what she's always done, show up. In the frozen dark before sunrise, in the mud, in the grief. While her sister staged funeral photos for Instagram and her father pushed a quitclaim deed across the table, Cass was in the barn. Doing the work, the way she always has. But now she's found the bills Sloan ignored. She's found the letter from the developers. She's found a Medicare charge that should never have existed. And alone in that cold barn, she made herself a quiet promise. Now comes the question we've all been waiting for: what was Martha really holding on to? And is it enough to stop what's coming? Stay with us, friends. The truth is closer than anyone at that table knows. 12 months before the funeral, on a Tuesday evening in early February. When the snow had been steady for 3 days and the roads into town were questionable at best, Martha Thorne had asked Cass to bring her the Bible. Not the small one from the nightstand, the big one. The family Bible, the one on the shelf in the back room between the old atlas and the box of Christmas cards she'd been meaning to go through since 1987. Cass had brought it without asking why, the way she'd learned to respond to most of Martha's requests in those later years. Simply and without adding to the weight of them. Martha had been in the armchair by the fireplace. A blanket across her knees, her breathing audible but controlled, her eyes carrying the particular brightness they sometimes held in the evenings. Alert, watchful, more present, somehow, than the daytime version of herself that existed closer to the surface. She had taken the Bible, opened it with the practiced ease of a woman who'd been opening it her whole life. And reached into the pages near the back not to read, but to retrieve. Folded and tucked between the final pages was a document, old enough that its folds had softened to fabric-like creases. The paper itself gone the color of weak tea. "Sit down, Cass," Martha had said. Cass sat on the footstool in front of her, the way she had 100 times. Martha unfolded the document slowly, her arthritic fingers careful with it. It was a deed, the language old-fashioned and formal in the way of legal documents from another era. A mineral rights deed, dated 1952, in the name of Harold Everett Thorne. "Your great-grandfather," Martha said. "He knew what was under this land before anyone had the equipment to prove it. He was laughed at for it." She smoothed the paper against her knee. Natural gas. A significant deposit. The surface rights and the mineral rights were registered separately. "Your grandfather never understood why Harold did that, thought it was just old man eccentricity." A thin sound, not quite a laugh. It wasn't. He was protecting it. Cass had looked at the document, then at Martha's face. "What's it worth?" she'd asked. The last assessment. Martha had paused, and in the firelight her expression had been something Cass had thought about many times since. Not triumphant exactly. More like a person laying down something they've been carrying for a very long time. $15 million. Give or take. Depending on the market. The fire had crackled. Outside, the snow came down steadily against the window. "Barrett took my youth," Martha had said, after a moment. Her voice was even not bitter, just factual, the tone of a woman reporting history. "He took the best years of my marriage and he spent them at card tables. And Sloane," she paused. "Sloane took my pride. Every visit was a performance. Every phone call a transaction. You learn, after a while, who is with you and who is just nearby." She had reached then into the fold of the blanket beside her and brought out a small passbook. The kind the old First National Bank of Bozeman had used before everything went digital. She held it out to Cass. The balance recorded in the ledger lines was $500,000. "I want you to have what you earned," Martha had said. "The land belongs to the one who loves it. That's always been true, and I'm making it legal." Cass had sat with the passbook in her hands and felt something move through her that she hadn't had words for then and still didn't entirely. Not relief, it was too large for relief. Not gratitude, it was too specific for that. It was more like recognition. Like being told, at last, that the thing she'd known to be true had always been true. She hadn't cried. She'd taken Martha's hand instead, and they'd sat like that by the fire for a long time. While the snow came down and the house held them both in its old, patient walls. She hadn't known, that evening, that Martha had already been to see Silas Vance. She hadn't known about the no contest clause, or the certified mental competency letter. Or the careful legal architecture that had been quietly assembled around her future while she was out in the pasture checking fence lines. She hadn't known any of the specifics. She had only known what Martha had told her, sitting in that firelit room with the mineral rights deed across her knee. The land belongs to the one who loves it. Now, pulling on her coat in the cold kitchen at 7 in the morning with Silas Vance's address written on the notepad by the phone, she understood that Martha's love had been more than a feeling. It had been a strategy. Ink and paper and legal foresight, assembled by a woman who had spent decades watching her family and understanding exactly what each of them was capable of. She put the address in her pocket. She was ready. Silas Vance's office occupied the second floor of a brick building on Main Street in downtown Bozeman. Up a narrow staircase that smelled of old wood and radiator heat. The frosted glass panel on his door read Vance and Associates, estate law in gold lettering that had probably been there since the Carter administration. Cass had called him the morning after her night in the barn. And he had answered on the second ring and said, without preamble, "I've been expecting to hear from you." She arrived at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, 20 minutes early, and sat in the small waiting area on a leather chair that had been worn to a comfortable softness over what appeared to be several decades of use. The receptionist, a composed woman of about 60 who introduced herself only as Helen, offered coffee, which Cass accepted, and then left her alone in the measured quiet of the office. The room smelled of leather and old paper, the specific dry, slightly sweet smell of documents kept carefully over long periods of time. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with law volumes and bound case files, and on the credenza behind Helen's desk were framed photographs that Cass had time to look at Silas with a fishing rod on what appeared to be the Gallatin River, Silas at a formal dinner. Silas and Martha Thorne standing on what was clearly the porch of the ranch house, both of them squinting into the sun, Martha's hand raised to shade her eyes, both of them laughing. The photograph was from some years back, Martha younger in it than the woman Cass had known, but the laugh was exactly the same. Silas came out of the inner office at 9 on the dot, a tall man, 65, lean in the way of men who had stayed active. His white hair cut close and his face carrying the weathered, deliberate quality of someone who had spent a long career learning to reveal exactly as much as he intended. He shook Cass's hand with both of his. "I knew your grandmother for 31 years, he said. "She was the most intentional person I've ever had as a client." He said it the way a person says something they've been waiting to say to the right person. "Come in." They sat across from each other at his desk, and he laid out for her, methodically and without theatrical flourish, the architecture of what Martha had built. The mineral rights deed from 1952 was already in Silas's possession, registered separately from the surface deed, exactly as Harold Thorne had intended. The will itself, the final, current version, executed 14 months ago and witnessed by 2 people who were not Silas, was clear and comprehensive. It had been drafted over 2 sessions, the first laying out the primary distribution, the second adding the no contest clause. Martha was very specific about the no contest provision, Silas said, folding his hands on the desk. She understood her family. He said it without judgment, the way a doctor might discuss a diagnosis. She wanted the document to be self-enforcing. Anyone who attempts to challenge it in a legal proceeding forfeits their entitlement entirely. What did she leave them? Sloane receives a sentimental bequest, $5,000 and a specific piece of jewelry. He paused. Which I understand she may have already taken without waiting for the reading. Cass nodded once. Barrett receives nothing from the estate. He is, however, formally notified of an outstanding debt, promissory notes totaling $55,000 that Martha held in his name. Those notes become due upon her death and are a liability against his own assets, not a claim on the estate. The room was quiet. Outside on Main Street, Cass could hear the ordinary sounds of a Thursday morning, a truck passing, a door opening and closing somewhere below. The certified mental competency letter, Silas continued, removing a document from the folder before him and setting it on the desk, was completed by Martha's primary physician 11 days before her death, at Martha's specific request. Her cognitive status at the time of the will's execution is thoroughly documented. He looked at Cass over the top of his reading glasses. If anyone were to claim she lacked capacity, they would be working against a significant body of evidence. Cass sat with this. When is the reading? Monday, 10 o'clock. He removed his glasses and set them on the desk. I expect Sloane and Barrett to attend. I have written to both of them. A brief pause. I would encourage you to arrive prepared for some degree of reaction. I know what kind of reaction to expect, Cass said. Yes. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. I rather thought you did. He looked at her steadily. Martha was right about you, Cassidy. She told me you were the one paying attention. That you would know what to do with it when the time came. Cass thought of the barn. She thought of the Medicare notice in her coat pocket. She thought of the photograph on the credenza, Martha laughing in the sun. I've been paying attention for 6 years, she said. I know. He closed the folder. So has she. Monday came with clear skies and a hard cold that had settled in overnight and showed no intention of leaving. Cass arrived at Silas's office at 9:45 in her good wool coat. The turquoise brooch conspicuously absent from anything she wore. She had said nothing to Sloane about it since the funeral, had filed it with everything else, had let it sit. Sloane arrived at 10 past 10 in a designer suit and the Louis Vuitton bag that Cass, who had spent an idle hour the night before researching, now knew retailed for $3,800 on a credit line she likely couldn't cover. Sloane's expression when she came through the door was the performed boredom of someone who had already decided how this would go. One hand resting on the bag's strap, eyes moving around the room with the particular confidence of the person who expects to be the most important one in it. Barrett arrived 3 minutes later, his face carrying the slightly compressed look of a man managing something. He had dressed better than usual, a blazer over his collared shirt, and he smelled, for once, of nothing stronger than aftershave. They arranged themselves on the chairs across from Silas's desk. Cass sat to the left, slightly apart, her hands in her lap, her posture straight. Silas put on his spectacles. "Before we begin," he said, in the measured, carrying tone of a man who had done this many times, "I need to remind everyone present of a specific provision in this document." He looked at each of them in turn. "This will contains a no contest clause. Under its terms, any party who initiates a formal legal challenge to the validity or distribution of this document forfeits entirely their entitlement under it. This applies to all named parties and all listed bequests, however modest." He set the document down. "Do all parties understand this provision?" Barrett said yes, his voice coming out slightly flat. Sloane examined her manicure and said, "Just read the damn thing." We know she was losing her mind at the end anyway. Silas looked at her for one moment, the look of a man who has heard something both expected and instructive. And then he lowered his eyes to the page and began to read. The office was very quiet when Silas read the relevant passage. It was a particular kind of quiet, not the absence of sound, but the presence of suspended breath, the quality of a room where 3 people have stopped moving at the same moment. The clock on the credenza ticked. Somewhere below, a car passed on Main Street. Silas's voice moved through the provisions in the measured, unhurried cadence of a man who understood that pacing, in these moments, was its own form of precision. He read the personal bequests first. $5,000 and the vintage turquoise brooch to Sloane Thorne Montgomery, with the notation that the brooch was to be returned by legal order if found to have been removed from the estate property prior to the will's execution. Barrett Thorne received acknowledgement of the outstanding promissory notes, $55,000. Due in full to the estate within 90 days and nothing else. Then Silas read the primary distribution. The 100 acres of ranch property located at the recorded address in Gallatin County, Montana, including all structures, water rights, surface rights, and the separately registered mineral rights deed of 1952. Encompassing the natural gas deposits underlying the property, estimated at a market value of $15 million, Silas paused, not for effect, but because the next words required their own space, are left entirely and without condition to Cassidy Ann Thorne. The room absorbed it. For a moment no one spoke and no one moved, and in that moment, Cass allowed herself, just briefly, to feel it, not triumph, nothing so clean as that, but something large and quiet and vindicating that moved through her chest like the first deep breath after a long time underwater. She thought of the barn floor at midnight. She thought of her fist against the post. She thought of Martha by the fireplace with the mineral rights deed across her knee, her voice steady and factual. "The land belongs to the one who loves it." Sloane stood up. The movement was abrupt enough that her chair scraped backward across the hardwood, and the sound of it broke the silence with a kind of percussive finality. She was on her feet before Silas had fully closed the document. Her face gone from performed composure to something rawer and less managed, the color high in her cheeks and her voice arriving loud and without its usual calibration. "That's a forgery." She said it flatly, like a statement of fact. She was not competent when this was written. She didn't know what she was signing. She turned to Barrett, who had gone very still in his chair, and then back to Silas, her voice climbing. "I am hiring an attorney today. This will does not stand. We are challenging this in court." Silas set his reading glasses on the desk with a deliberate, unhurried movement. "Ms. Thorne Montgomery," he said, "I need to direct your attention to the provision I read before we began." "I don't care about your provision." by stating, in this room and in the presence of witnesses, your intention to initiate a formal legal challenge to this document. Silas's voice was quiet and entirely without heat. You have triggered the no contest clause. He let that settle. The $5,000 bequest and the brooch that were designated for you in this will are now void. You leave this reading with nothing. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Sloane stared at him. For a moment her expression held the look of someone who has put their full weight onto a floor they expected to be solid and found nothing underneath. Then the expression shifted into something harder and more familiar, the expression of a person who, having lost one position, immediately begins calculating the next. I'll challenge the clause itself. You're welcome to pursue that, Silas said, with the calm of a man describing weather. I would advise you to consult with an estate attorney before doing so. The clause has substantial case law behind it in this state, and the competency documentation is thorough. He paused. Martha met with her physician specifically for that purpose, Ms. Thorne Montgomery. She anticipated this conversation. The room was quiet again. Sloane remained standing, her hand on the back of her chair, the Louis Vuitton bag hanging from her wrist, and in the silence Cass could see her processing it, all of it, the whole architecture of what had been waiting here. The trap that had been laid with such patient, deliberate care by a woman who had spent decades watching her family and understanding exactly what each of them would do. Barrett had said nothing throughout. He was sitting in his chair with his blazer slightly crooked and his face the color of a man who has received bad news he was not entirely unprepared for. Silas reached into the folder and withdrew a second document, a formal demand notice. Clean and official, and placed it on the corner of the desk closest to Barrett. $55,000, Silas said. Due to the estate within 90 days. The promissory notes are notarized and fully enforceable. Barrett looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he reached out and picked it up with both hands, and Cass watched his face move through something she couldn't fully name, not quite shame, but something in the same territory, the recognition of a man who has spent decades running out ahead of his debts, and has finally reached the edge of the space available to run. I'll need a payment plan, he said. His voice was quiet and entirely without its earlier performance of ease. That can be arranged through the estate, Silas said. Sloane gathered her bag and her coat with quick, efficient movements, the movements of someone who needed to be out of a room immediately. She did not look at Cass. She moved toward the door, and Cass watched her go. The designer suit, the bag bought on credit. The heeled boots wrong for the weather, and felt none of the satisfaction she had expected to feel. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable. Something closer to completion. The door opened and closed. Barrett sat for another few minutes, the demand notice on his knee. And then he stood with the careful movements of a man whose legs had gone slightly uncertain, and he nodded at Silas and did not look at Cass, and he left. And then it was just the two of them, Cass and Silas, in the leather and paper quiet of his office. The clock ticking on the credenza, Martha laughing in the photograph. It's done, Silas said. Cass looked at the photograph. She thought about 6 years. She thought about 5 a.m. and frozen mud and $30,000 of ignored medical bills and a quitclaim deed pushed across an oak table. She thought about a woman by a fireplace with an old deed in her arthritic hands, saying the land belongs to the one who loves it in a voice like a person setting something down. It is, she said. Her voice, when she heard it, sounded steadier than she felt. But only by a small margin. And that, she thought, was about right. Spring came late to that part of Montana, the way it always did, not all at once, but in increments, each mild day, followed by another hard freeze, the land giving up its winter by degrees rather than all at once, as if it needed to be sure you'd earned it before it showed you what it could become. By mid-March the snow on the flats was beginning to pull back from the fence lines, leaving dark strips of bare ground that the cattle moved toward with the particular purposeful hunger of animals who knew what they were looking for. The Bridger Range held its white for another month after that, but down on the property, the mud returned, and with it the smell of the earth beginning to work again, that dense, iron and green smell that Cass had always associated with the word starting. She was on the porch when the sun came fully over the mountains on the first clear morning of the new season. She'd been up since 4:30, old habit, settled into her bones now, not something she could have slept through even if she'd tried. She'd done the morning check on the cattle, refilled the bird feeder on Martha's window, stood for a while in the kitchen, drinking her coffee and looking at the table that no longer had any papers on it. The tax bill had been paid. The estate had been settled. The medical debt had been resolved through the estate attorney, and a formal complaint had been filed with the state regarding the billing irregularities. Barrett had contacted Silas's office about a payment schedule and had not contacted Cass directly, and that was fine. That was more than fine. She carried her coffee out to the porch and stood at the railing. The Bridger Range was gold and white in the early light, the sky above it the particular clear blue that only existed at altitude in early spring. A color so precise it almost didn't seem real. The fields ran out from the house in all directions, the fence lines straight and true. The far pasture where her cattle were already moving in the thin morning light. 100 acres. Her 100 acres. She set her coffee on the porch rail and reached into the breast pocket of her flannel shirt. The turquoise brooch had been returned by legal order 2 weeks after the will reading. Delivered in a small padded envelope with a notation from Silas's office and nothing else from Sloane. Cass had taken it out of the envelope and held it for a long time in the kitchen. Turning it over in her fingers, the silver setting, slightly tarnished now, the stone itself the particular blue-green of a shallow lake on a clear day. She had set it on the windowsill above the sink while she figured out what to do with it. And it had stayed there through the rest of February and into March, sitting in the afternoon light, and every day when she washed her hands at that sink she'd looked at it. This morning she'd taken it off the sill and put it in her shirt pocket. She pinned it now to the collar of her flannel, at the angle Martha had always worn it slightly tilted, the way the clasp sat when you didn't overthink it. She smoothed it with her thumb and looked at it for a moment and then looked back at the mountains. Sloane's situation in Chicago had become known to her in pieces, through peripheral channels, a mutual acquaintance, an overheard conversation at the feed store. The kind of small-town information osmosis that operates without anyone intending it. The short version was that the lifestyle Sloane had been maintained entirely on borrowed credit, and the borrowed credit had run out. There was a bankruptcy filing. There was, apparently, a very difficult conversation with the bank that held the high-interest loan she'd taken for the handbag. Cass had received this information without pleasure and without the particular satisfaction she might once have expected. The truth was that she didn't think about Sloane very much anymore. She had noticed, with some surprise, that the anger she'd carried since the funeral had quieted, not disappeared, but settled into something lower and less consuming. Something she could work alongside without being powered by it. Barrett was making payments. Small ones, given his current employment at a hardware store in Billings, but consistent. Silas had confirmed this in his last update. Cass had asked about a reasonable schedule, and they had established one. That was all she'd asked for. She picked up her coffee. On the kitchen table inside, there was a new piece of paper. Not a bill, not a demand, not a deed requiring her signature. It was a hiring contract, an offer from the Gallatin Valley Veterinary Clinic. An independent practice that had been struggling to serve the low-income farming community in the county's outlying areas. Cass had approached them 3 weeks ago with a proposal she would fund an expanded outreach program through the estate. One that would allow them to provide subsidized care to small and mid-size operations that couldn't otherwise afford it. The contract outlined her role as both lead large animal technician and program coordinator. She had read it twice and then set it on the table and let it sit there for a day, the way she let important things sit before she decided. This morning she was going to sign it. She finished her coffee and set the mug on the railing and stood for another moment looking at the land, her land, Martha's land, Harold Thorne's land with its century-old mineral rights. And its fields going soft now at the edges with the first pale suggestions of green. She thought about a fireplace and a Bible and an old deed unfolded with careful arthritic hands. She thought about a woman who had loved this land her whole life. And had arranged, with the patient precision of someone who had been paying attention for decades, for it to pass to someone who would love it the same way. She walked back inside. At the kitchen table she sat down, uncapped the pen, and signed her name at the bottom of the contract. Cassidy Ann Thorne. She looked at her own signature, in her own hand, on something that was entirely hers. At 31, she thought, you didn't expect to feel this way about a signature. You didn't expect the simple act of writing your own name to feel like something that had taken 6 years to earn and was worth every single one of them. She capped the pen. Then she pulled on her boots and her coat and the brooch at her collar and went out to start the day, the mud still there underfoot, still thick and cold and entirely familiar, and her heart, for the first time in as long as she could remember, as light as the spring sky opening up above the mountains. Friends, how did you find today's story? I have been sitting with it since the last page, and I'll be honest with you, it's the kind of story that doesn't leave you right away. It stays with you the way the best ones do, somewhere just behind the ribs, asking you to keep thinking about it. We watched Cassidy Thorne do something that looked, from the outside, like simply showing up. Getting up before the sun. Doing the hard, unglamorous, invisible work. Caring for a woman who had been abandoned by the people who were supposed to love her. And we watched the people around her treat that as nothing, as free rent, as a maid's service, as something to be discarded the moment it was no longer convenient. But Martha saw. Martha had been seeing, clearly and carefully, for a long time. And what she built for Cassidy wasn't just a legal document. It was a declaration. It said, I see what you did. I see who you are. And I'm making sure the world eventually catches up to the truth. That's what this story is really about, I think. Not the money, not the mineral rights, not the bankruptcy or the debt notices, though all of that was deeply, deeply satisfying. It's about the question of whether the things we do when no one's watching will ever be witnessed. Whether the love we give quietly, without scorekeeping, without an audience, will ever be accounted for. Martha's answer was yes. And she made sure of it. There's something in that for all of us. Most of us have known someone who was overlooked. Maybe we've been that person ourselves, putting in the work, keeping the faith, not quite sure if any of it was adding up to something. Cassidy's story is for those of us who needed a reminder that it does. It adds up. Someone is always keeping a truer count than the one we can see. I hope today's story brought you a little of that, a little comfort, a little fire, and something to hold on to the next time the work feels invisible. If it did, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And please do hit subscribe, and give us a like, because more stories just like this one are on their way, and I'd love for you to be here when they arrive. Until next time, friends. Take good care of yourselves.